The snow was coming down hard, like someone upstairs had ripped open a giant sack of flour and was just letting it pour out, covering the whole world in a quiet blanket of white. Wyatt Garrison felt the cold deep in his bones. He pulled his heavy coat tighter, the worn wool scratching against his neck, and tipped the brim of his hat to block the wind that was biting at his face. It was almost midnight. The ranch should have been asleep, silent except for the whisper of the wind through the pines. But something had pulled him out of bed. Something was wrong. It was a feeling he got sometimes, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the weather. Maybe it was just coyotes, their yips and howls echoing from the timberline. Or maybe it was just a memory, sharp and painful, rising up in the dead of night. He swung the lantern in his hand, and the light threw dancing circles of gold across the fresh snow. The horse corral was empty, their dark shapes huddled inside the barn for warmth. He could see their breath puffing out in white clouds in the freezing air. Nothing looked out of place. He almost turned back, ready to let the cold and the quiet swallow him up again. But then he heard it. A sound so small, so faint, he nearly missed it. It was thin and broken, like a kitten crying from inside a locked box. It wasn't the creek, it wasn't the wind. His gut twisted into a knot. He followed the sound, his boots making soft crunching noises in the deep snow. He moved past the familiar shape of the fence line, his breath turning to fog in front of his face. The pasture gave way to a gentle slope that led down into the dark timber. The sound came again, a little louder this time, sharper. Definitely not a coyote, not any animal he'd ever heard. "Who's out there?" he called out, his voice sounding small and rough against the vast, silent woods. No answer, only the soft hush of more snow falling, each flake seeming to absorb all sound. He kept walking, his lantern held high, his other hand resting on the cold steel of the rifle slung over his shoulder. The pine trees grew thicker here, their heavy branches creating a dark canopy overhead. The lantern light cut through the gloom, and then it hit something. Something that didn't belong. A trail of tiny footprints in the snow. He knelt down for a closer look. The prints were small, impossibly small, like a child's. And they were bare feet. Two sets of them, side by side, already starting to fill in with new snow. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran down Wyatt's spine. Who in their right mind would be out here, in this weather, with no shoes? He stood up, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs, and followed the trail. The tracks led him deeper into the woods, to a place where a huge old log lay half buried in a snowdrift. The crying had stopped. Now all he could hear was a faint, frantic breathing, quick and shallow. He lowered the lantern, peering into the dark, hollowed-out space inside the log. Two faces blinked back at him. They were twin girls, no older than 6 or 7. They were huddled together so tightly, they looked like they had been carved from a single piece of wood. Their dresses were nothing more than thin, ragged cotton. Their cheeks were raw and red from the brutal cold, and their hair was a tangled mess of pine needles and twigs. One girl was clutching her sister's hand like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to the world. For a long, silent moment, no one moved. No one spoke. "It's all right," Wyatt said finally, his voice rough but gentle. He crouched low to the ground, trying to make himself look smaller, less threatening. "I'm not here to hurt you." The smaller of the two girls whispered something, her lips so pale they were almost invisible against her skin. "Mister," she breathed, her voice a tiny thread of sound, "we can't run no more." Those words hit Wyatt like a physical blow. He felt them in his chest, a sharp, twisting pain. "Are you two alone out here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The older girl shook her head, a quick, jerky motion. "They're coming," she whispered, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed far too big for her small face. "Please, please don't let him find us." Wyatt set the lantern down in the snow. Its warm glow cast long, distorted shadows that stretched and danced among the trees. Whoever these girls were running from, the fear of being caught was greater than the fear of freezing to death in the middle of a blizzard. Wyatt had seen that kind of fear before. He'd seen it in the eyes of cornered animals and in the faces of men who knew their time was up. "Climb on out of there," he said gently. "You'll freeze solid if you stay in that log." The older twin hesitated for a second, her gaze darting from Wyatt to the darkness behind him. Then she slowly crawled out, pulling her sister along with her. They were so small, so light, he felt like he could have picked them both up with one arm. He shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around their trembling shoulders. The coat swallowed them whole, the sleeves dangling far past their hands. "We have to go," the little one pleaded, her eyes fixed on the dark woods they had just come from. "He's gonna find us." "Where to?" Wyatt asked softly. Neither girl answered. They just stood there in the lantern light, two tiny, fragile figures against the vast, unforgiving winter. It was clear they had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. His first thought was to take them into town, to hand them over to Sheriff Miller. It was the sensible thing to do, the right thing to do, but something stopped him. Something in their eyes, a deep, primal fear that told him the law was the last thing they wanted. They would rather trust a complete stranger in the woods than face whatever was waiting for them in town. "All right," he said, picking up the lantern. "My cabin's this way. There's a warm fire and dry clothes waiting for you." They followed him without another word, their tiny footprints disappearing into his own larger ones. The snow was getting deeper, and the younger girl stumbled and fell. Without thinking, Wyatt turned and scooped her up into his arms. She flinched at first, then went limp against his chest, too exhausted to fight. By the time they reached the small, sturdy cabin, his arm ached from her weight, even though she was light as a feather. He kicked the snow from his boots on the porch and carried her inside, setting her down gently on the floor near the stone hearth. He coaxed the embers in the fireplace back to life, and soon a small flame flickered, then grew, casting a warm orange glow around the room. The heat slowly began to thaw the ice from his beard and the frost from their hair. The girls didn't speak. They just watched him with those wide, haunted eyes as he filled a kettle with water and laid an old, thick quilt on the floor for them. It was as if they expected him to vanish at any moment, leaving them alone in the dark again. When the fire was crackling merrily, Wyatt sat back on his heels and finally met their gaze. "No one's hurting you tonight," he said quietly. It was more than a statement. It was a promise. His hand rested near the rifle he had leaned against the wall by the door, and then, through the sound of the wind, another sound came, distant at first but getting closer. The unmistakable thud of horses' hooves, muffled by the snow. The older girl's face went completely white. "They found us," she whispered, her voice trembling. Wyatt was on his feet in an instant, the lantern light glinting off the long, dark barrel of the rifle as he grabbed it. Suddenly, the small cabin felt tight and suffocating, filled with the weight of whatever was coming for them out of the darkness. The hoofbeats grew louder, then faded away into the night, leaving only the sound of the wind and the soft hiss of snow against the window panes. Wyatt stood frozen, the rifle held tight in his hands, long after the sound was gone. He listened, straining to hear another snap of a twig, another shadow moving through the trees. But there was nothing. Only the endless, lonely song of the wind. The twins were pressed against the far wall, their small bodies rigid with fear, their eyes wide and shining in the firelight. Slowly, Wyatt lowered the rifle and set it back by the door. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "You're safe for now," he said, his voice more steady than he felt. Whoever that was, they passed on by. The younger girl buried her face in her sister's side, but the older one kept her eyes locked on the door, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. Wyatt knew that feeling, the feeling that even when the danger is gone, it's not really gone. It's just waiting. He found a pair of his thickest wool socks in an old trunk, along with a flannel shirt that was big enough to be a dress on them. "Here," he said, crouching down so he wouldn't seem so tall and intimidating. "Get out of those wet things before you catch your death." The older girl watched him for a long moment, her chin tilted up defiantly, like a wild colt deciding whether to trust or to bolt. Finally, she took the shirt and helped her sister get into it first. Wyatt turned away to give them some privacy, busying himself by adding another log to the fire. The kettle on the hearth began to whistle, filling the small cabin with steam and the faint, comforting smell of iron and wood smoke. He poured some warm water into a chipped enamel basin and set it near the fire with a clean rag. He waited until they were huddled together in the big shirt, their wet clothes in a small, sad pile on the floor. You girls have names? He asked gently. They were silent for a moment. Then the older one spoke, her voice so soft he had to lean in to hear her. We do, she said, but it don't matter. They'll just change 'em as soon as they sell us. Wyatt's hand froze on the handle of the kettle. The word hit him like a physical blow. It was quiet, but it was sharp enough to split bone. Sell us. He turned slowly, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his face. He looked at the two small girls, their faces pale and serious in the warm glow of the cabin. Sell you, he repeated, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. The older girl's jaw worked, but she didn't say anything else. The little one hugged her knees to her chest, staring down at the wooden floorboards as if she could will them to open up and swallow her whole. Wyatt didn't push. Whatever had chased them out into a blizzard was a monster he couldn't yet imagine. He could see its shadow in the way they flinched at every sound, the way they kept glancing at the window, as if expecting a hand to reach through the glass and drag them back into the nightmare. He poured hot water into 2 tin cups, added a spoonful of molasses to each, and handed them to the girls. They took the cups with both hands, cradling the warmth against their small bodies, and sipped slowly. You got any folks in town? He asked quietly. They both shook their heads. Then you'll stay here tonight, he said, his voice firm. No one will bother you under this roof. He made a bed for them near the fire, piling up quilts until it looked as soft as a snowdrift. The younger girl crawled under the covers without a word, her body giving in to exhaustion. The older one lingered, watching him with those cautious, knowing eyes, as if she was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to turn into a trap. Are you going to lock the door? She asked finally. Soon as I put out the lantern, he promised. She gave a single sharp nod, then slid in beside her sister. Within minutes, their breathing evened out, rising and falling in time with the crackle of the fire. Wyatt sank into his old wooden chair, resting his elbows on his knees. He hadn't had another soul in this cabin for almost 3 years. Not since the fever had taken his wife, leaving the rooms feeling too big, too quiet. He had told himself he was used to the solitude, but the presence of these 2 small, sleeping girls changed the very air in the room. It didn't feel empty anymore. He stayed awake all night, the rifle resting across his knees. The fire burned down to glowing embers, casting long, reaching shadows on the walls that looked like grasping hands. Every time the wind rattled the shutters, his grip on the rifle tightened. Just before dawn, when the sky was a pale, bruised grey, he stood up and quietly stepped outside. The snow had fallen heavily through the night, covering the world in a fresh, clean blanket. But it wasn't enough to hide the tracks leading to his door. And it wasn't enough to hide the new set of tracks. Bigger prints, deeper. A single rider had circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, like a wolf testing the walls of a sheep pen. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Whoever was hunting these girls had been right here, close enough to touch the porch, close enough to hear the fire crackling inside, close enough to know they were here. When he stepped back into the cabin, the older girl was sitting up in the makeshift bed. Her hair was sticking up in all directions, and her eyes were heavy with sleep, but she was awake. And she was watching him. You going after them? She asked, her voice raspy. Wyatt shook his head. Not yet. First, I need to know exactly what we're up against. The girl bit her lip. If they find us, she said, her voice flat and certain, they'll take us back. And they won't stop this time. Wyatt knelt down so he was at her eye level. Then we'll just have to make sure they don't find you, he said. Not ever again. He stood up and added another log to the fire, the flames leaping up to greet the fresh wood. Outside, the wind had died down, the world was hushed, holding its breath, and then, from somewhere in the trees, a single horse whinnied. It was a sound that was too close, too knowing. Wyatt's hand went back to the rifle. This was far from over. By mid-morning, the heavy snow had turned to a fine, swirling dust. The world was still white, but the sharp edges of the land were starting to show through again. The dark line of the fences, the frozen curve of the creek bed, and the faint, ghost-like tracks of last night's visitor. Wyatt stood on the porch, his collar turned up against the biting cold, his breath forming a cloud in the air. Inside, he could see the girls pressed against the window, their small silhouettes like 2 little birds watching for a hawk. He stepped down into the yard, his boots crunching in the snow. The first set of prints were his own from the night before, softer now, their edges blurred by the new snow. Beside them were the tiny bare footprints of the girls, sharp and clear where he had carried them. But there was another trail, a sinister one that cut a wide, deliberate circle around the cabin. Heavy, deep-set hoofprints, a slow-moving predator sizing up its prey. He crouched down next to one of the prints, brushing away the top layer of snow with his gloved hand. The edges were still crisp. This rider had been here just before dawn, so close. He could picture him now, a dark figure on a dark horse, sitting motionless in the trees, watching the smoke curl from the chimney, knowing the girls were inside. He rose slowly and scanned the tree line. Nothing. The world was perfectly still, holding its breath. When he went back inside, the older twin was standing by the fire, her small jaw set in a tight, determined line. "They came back, didn't they?" she asked. It wasn't a question. He just nodded. The younger girl, sensing the tension, climbed into the big armchair near the hearth and curled into a small ball. "They'll come again," she whispered to herself. Wyatt knelt down, resting one knee on the rough-hewn floorboards so he could look them both in the eye. "I won't let anyone take you," he said, his voice low and steady. "Not while I've got a say in it." The older twin's eyes searched his face, weighing his words, trying to decide if he was just another adult who would make promises he couldn't keep. "You don't even know us," she said, her voice a mixture of suspicion and a desperate flickering hope. "Don't have to," he said simply. "You're here. That's enough." Something in her expression changed then. It wasn't quite trust, not yet, but it was the first tiny crack in the thick wall of fear and distrust she had built around herself. She gave him a quick, sharp nod, then turned to pull the quilt a little higher over her sister. Wyatt put a cast-iron skillet on the stove and fried up some cornbread from the last of his dough. The smell filled the cabin, warm and comforting, a stark contrast to the cold, menacing silence outside. He set the plate of cornbread on the small table between them. The little one hesitated for only a second before grabbing a piece with both hands and eating it like she hadn't seen food in a week. Her sister ate more slowly, but when she caught Wyatt's eye, she almost smiled. "Preacher back in town used to say," Wyatt murmured, more to himself than to them, as he added another log to the fire, "pure religion is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction. Guess I never really listened till now." The younger girl tilted her head. "You go to church?" "Sometimes," he admitted, though it had been a long time. "What about you two?" She shook her head vigorously. "Uncle said folks don't want us there, said we were bad luck." The word uncle hung in the air. So the man had a name, a relation. Wyatt's jaw tightened. "Doesn't sound to me like you're the ones bringing the trouble," he said grimly. The girls exchanged a look, a silent, knowing glance that was full of a history he couldn't begin to understand. He knew there was more to this story, a lot more, but he also knew they wouldn't tell him until they were ready. After they had eaten, Wyatt pulled on his coat again. "Come on," he said, "lesson time." He led them outside. The sun had finally broken through the clouds, and the snow was so bright it hurt to look at. "See those tracks?" he said, pointing to the ominous circle around the cabin. "You can tell a lot from a print. How fresh it is, which way it's headed, how much the horse weighs." The girls edged closer, their natural curiosity starting to win out over their fear. He showed them how the horse had stood still for a long time in one spot, its weight shifting from hoof to hoof. "He was here a long time," the older girl said, her voice a whisper. "Long enough," Wyatt confirmed. "But he didn't come to the door. That means he's watching. For now." As he spoke, the younger girl slipped her small, cold hand into his. She did it so naturally, so unthinkingly, that the simple trust of the gesture hit him like a punch to the gut. It hollowed him out. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze before leading them back into the warmth of the cabin. The rest of the day was quiet, but it was a heavy, waiting kind of quiet. Wyatt busied himself mending a broken hinge on the barn door, but he never let the cabin out of his sight. The girls stayed by the window, a silent two-person watchtower. He could feel their presence, the way the small cabin seemed to breathe differently with them in it. It was no longer just a shelter, it was a sanctuary. By evening, the clouds had rolled back in, thick and grey, heavy with the promise of more snow. Wyatt checked the rifle again. He set the lantern by the door. "If we hear anyone riding close, you get behind me and you stay there," he told them. The older twin nodded, her face solemn. Night fell like a black curtain, deep and absolute. The fire burned low. Wyatt dozed in his chair, his senses on high alert. He was torn from his light sleep by the sound of hooves. Closer this time. There was no mistaking it. The girls scrambled out from under their quilt, their eyes wide in the dim firelight, and rushed to his side. Wyatt grabbed the lantern and moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. A single rider sat on his horse just beyond the fence, a dark silhouette against the moonlit snow. He was just sitting there, watching the cabin, waiting. Wyatt's hand found the cold, familiar stock of the rifle. "Stay down," he whispered, his voice a steady anchor in the rising tide of their fear. The rider didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he wheeled his horse around and melted back into the dark trees. Wyatt stayed at the window for a long time, staring at the empty fence line. The girls were holding their breath, as if making a sound might somehow call him back. Finally, the older twin whispered, her voice trembling but full of a chilling certainty, "He'll come back, and next time he won't just watch." Wyatt didn't argue. He knew she was right. He set the rifle back across his knees, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the window, and waited for whatever was coming next. The next day passed in a blur of tense silence. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the air had a sharp, metallic smell that promised more snow. Wyatt spent the afternoon chopping wood with a restless, angry energy, stacking it high against the cabin wall as if building a fortress. He barely felt the cold. The girls stayed inside, their whispers a constant, soft murmur by the fire. The 4 log walls of the cabin had become their entire world. When the hoofbeats came, they were slow and deliberate. Not the sound of someone passing by. This was the sound of someone arriving. The girls froze, their eyes instantly finding his. Wyatt wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve and went to the window. A lone rider sat on his horse just outside the yard. It was the same man. Same horse, same square-shouldered silhouette. But this time he wasn't hiding in the shadows. And he wasn't leaving. Wyatt took his rifle from its pegs on the wall and opened the door. The wind hit him like a slap in the face. He stepped out onto the porch, his boots planting firmly in the snow. "You plan on sitting out there all day?" Wyatt called out, his voice carrying easily in the still, cold air. "Or did you have something to say?" The man nudged his horse forward, stopping just short of the fence. His face was weathered and rough, chapped by the wind. His eyes were like 2 chips of flint under the wide brim of his hat. "You've got something that belongs to me," the man said, his voice a low growl. Wyatt didn't move a muscle. "Don't reckon I do." The man jerked his chin toward the cabin. "2 little runaways, kin of mine. You hand 'em over and we'll call it square." Inside, Wyatt could hear the soft scuff of small feet on the floorboards, the faint click of the door latch as the girls pressed against it, listening. "They don't look like they have any kin worth having," Wyatt said, his voice even and cold. The man's mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You don't know what you're stepping into, rancher. Their daddy owed me big. He died before he could pay. These girls. They're the payment." Wyatt's jaw hardened until it ached. "They aren't cattle to be traded for a debt." "They're mine by law," the man snapped, his voice getting louder. "I've got papers. You think the sheriff won't back me up?" The weight of that threat settled in the air between them. Wyatt knew how the law worked in these parts. It often bent for men with loud voices and deep pockets. Men like this one. "The law doesn't mean much if it forgets about mercy," Wyatt said finally. The man's eyes narrowed to slits. "You think you can keep 'em? I can come back with those papers. I can come back with more men." Wyatt lifted the rifle just a few inches, not aiming it, but letting its presence speak for him. "You come back with whoever you please," he said softly, "but no child leaves this place scared." For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the stamping of the horse's hooves and the sigh of the wind through the pines. The man stared at Wyatt, his face a mask of cold fury. Finally, he spat into the snow. You just bought yourself a whole world of trouble, Garrison, he snarled. He wrenched his horse's head around and galloped back toward the trees, leaving a trail of churned-up snow in his wake. Wyatt stood on the porch, the rifle still in his hands, until the sound of the horse had completely faded. When he turned to go back inside, the girls were standing in the doorway, their faces pale but their eyes steady. "You didn't let him take us," the younger one said, her voice filled with a fragile wonder. "Wasn't ever going to," Wyatt said gruffly. The older girl stepped forward, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. "He'll be back," she said, her voice low. "He'll bring more men. He always gets what he wants." "Maybe this time he won't," Wyatt said quietly. "But you're right. We'd better be ready." That night, Wyatt didn't even try to sleep. He left the lantern burning in the window, a silent message to anyone watching from the darkness. He set an extra stack of logs by the fire and checked the action on his rifle twice. The girls stayed close, watching him with a new look in their eyes. It was something like awe. "Why are you helping us?" the older one asked at last, her voice barely a whisper. Wyatt stared into the flames. "'Cause I reckon someone ought to," he said. She studied his face for a long time, then gave a small nod, as if filing his answer away for later. A little while later, the younger girl, without asking, climbed up into his lap and curled into a ball, laying her head against his chest. She fit there like she was always meant to be there. Wyatt sat stiffly for a moment, surprised by the contact. Then slowly, he let one of his big, rough hands rest on her back. The hours crawled by. The promised snow began to fall again, thick and heavy, muffling the world in a deep, unnerving silence. Wyatt must have dozed off in the chair, the rifle still across his knees, because the next thing he knew, a sound had jolted him awake. It wasn't hoofbeats this time, it was the sound of boots. Many boots, crunching in the snow. He was on his feet in an instant, moving to the window. Dark shapes were moving at the edge of the yard. More than one. More than two. The bobbing light of lanterns flickered among the trees. "They're here," the older girl whispered, her small body pressed against his back. Wyatt reached for his coat, his heart beating a steady, calm rhythm in his chest. The time for waiting was over. "Get low," he told the girls, his voice firm. "Stay by the fire, and don't you move until I say so." He opened the door and stepped out into the swirling snow, the lantern held high in one hand, the rifle ready in the other. The figures emerged from the darkness. It was the man from before, Silas, at their head, and he was flanked by two other men, big burly shapes in the dark. They stopped at the fence line, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of their own lanterns, the falling snow catching in their beards like tiny diamonds. "Evening, Garrison," Silas said, his voice as sharp and cold as a knife's edge. "Told you I'd be back." Wyatt didn't flinch. "And I told you," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "no child leaves here scared." Silas's hand drifted down toward the pistol holstered at his belt. "Then maybe," he said with a cruel smile, "we'll just have to see who scares first." Wyatt raised his lantern higher. The light caught the long, dark barrel of his rifle, the hard, unyielding set of his jaw. Behind him, inside the warm, firelit cabin, he could feel the weight of two small lives, two small girls who were counting on him. The snow kept falling, soft and silent, as the cold night air thickened with the promise of violence. The night held its breath. Every snowflake seemed to fall in slow motion, like ash from a dying fire. Wyatt stood his ground on the porch, a lone figure against the warm light of the cabin, the rifle held steady in his hands. Silas dismounted, his boots sinking into the deep snow. His two companions moved up to flank him, their faces grim and shadowed. One of them was holding a thick length of rope, the other carried a heavy wooden club. This wasn't about talking anymore. "You've got a choice, Garrison," Silas said, his voice deceptively calm. "Hand over the girls, and I walk away. You stand in my way. Well, you won't like what happens next." Wyatt's fingers tightened on the rifle stock. "You come here in the dead of night with armed men to take two little girls. You already made your choice." Silas's smile turned into a sneer. "You really think one old rancher and a hunting rifle can stop us? The law's on my side." "The law's not standing here right now," Wyatt said, his voice as cold as the wind. "But I am." For a long, heart-stopping moment, no one moved. The world seemed to shrink to the small, snowy patch of ground between the porch and the fence. Then Silas gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The man with the rope took a step forward. Click. The sound of Wyatt cocking the rifle was sharp and loud, a crack of thunder in the silent night. "That next step is your last," Wyatt said softly. The man froze, his eyes wide. He looked back at Silas, who was glaring at Wyatt with pure hatred. Wyatt didn't blink. He didn't waver. The wind howled through the pines, a mournful, judging sound. The standoff stretched, the tension so thick you could almost taste it. "You won't shoot," Silas said finally, his voice full of bluster. Wyatt's reply was quiet, almost sorrowful. "Try me." Suddenly, another light appeared in the distance, a single lantern, bobbing and weaving through the trees. Then came the sound of a horse, ridden hard, its hooves pounding against the frozen ground. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was the sheriff, a heavy coat wrapped around him, his badge glinting in the lantern light. He reined in his horse, his eyes taking in the scene in an instant. Wyatt on the porch with a rifle, and Silas and his two thugs at the fence. "What in the hell is going on here, Silas?" he demanded. Silas spun around, his face a mixture of anger and surprise. "Garrison's harboring my property, Sheriff. 2 runaways. They're mine by debt, and I'm here to collect what's owed." The sheriff's gaze shifted to Wyatt. "Is that true, Wyatt?" "They're children, Sheriff," Wyatt said, his voice ringing with conviction. "Not property. They'd rather freeze to death in the woods than go back with him. You tell me if the law calls that justice." The sheriff looked past Wyatt, through the open cabin door. He could see the 2 girls, their pale faces framed by the firelight, huddled together like frightened rabbits. Something in his weathered face softened. "You got papers proving guardianship, Silas?" the sheriff asked. Silas hesitated for just a second. "I'll have 'em come spring, from the circuit judge." "Then you don't have 'em now," the sheriff said, swinging down from his horse. "And as far as the law is concerned, these girls stay put until a proper court can hear the case." Silas's face turned dark with rage. "You're siding with him?" "I'm siding with what's right," the sheriff said, his hand resting on the butt of his own pistol. "You want to push this, you push it with me." Silas cursed under his breath and jerked his head at his men. "This ain't over, Garrison," he snarled. He climbed back on his horse, and the 3 of them rode off into the night, their dark shapes quickly swallowed by the falling snow. Wyatt didn't lower the rifle until they were completely gone. The sheriff walked up to the porch, his boots crunching in the snow. He studied Wyatt's face for a long moment. "You just made a powerful enemy, Wyatt." "Wouldn't be the first time," Wyatt replied. The sheriff nodded, then tipped his hat. "Keep those girls safe. I'll file the papers in the morning. Make it official." He rode off, leaving Wyatt alone in the quiet night. When Wyatt turned, the girls were still in the doorway, exactly where he'd left them. "Is it over?" the younger one asked, her voice a tiny whisper. "For now," Wyatt said. "As long as you're here, you're safe." The older girl stepped forward, slow and careful, as if testing the floorboards to make sure they were still solid. "He won't stop." "Then neither will I," Wyatt said. And then something inside her broke. Silently, she crossed the room and wrapped her arms around his waist, clinging to him with all her might. Her sister followed, pressing her face against his rough coat. Wyatt stood there, frozen for a moment, the rifle still warm in his hands. Then he leaned it against the wall and put his arms around both of them, holding them tight. They stayed that way for a long time, the 3 of them silhouetted against the fire, until the world outside, with all its cold and its danger, seemed to fade away. When he finally tucked them back into their bed of quilts, they were already half asleep, their hands still clasped together. Wyatt sat in his chair and listened to the sound of their soft, even breathing and the wind rattling the shutters. He felt something settle in his chest, a heavy weight he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying, lifting for the first time since the fever took his wife. The cabin didn't feel empty anymore. At dawn, he took out his pocket knife and carefully carved 2 small letters into the thick wooden beam above the hearth, side by side, where they would stay for as long as the cabin stood. When the girls woke up, they found him cooking biscuits, the warm, buttery smell filling the room like a promise. "You can stay," he said quietly, sliding the skillet off the fire. "As long as you want. As far as I'm concerned, This is your home now." The older girl looked at the newly carved initials on the beam, then back at Wyatt, her face a beautiful, heartbreaking mixture of disbelief and relief. "You mean it?" she whispered. Wyatt just nodded, and then she smiled. A real smile, a small, trembling thing that lit up her whole face. And for the first time since he had found them in that cold, dark log, the fear was completely gone from her eyes. The snow had stopped falling, sunlight was streaming through the windows, spilling across the floorboards in pools of gold. It wasn't a mansion or a promise shouted from the rooftops. It was warm biscuits on a wooden table, the smell of pine logs burning, and the sound of quiet breathing in a safe room. And maybe that's how a family is made, not with papers or with laws, but one small, fierce act of kindness at a time. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching.